From California's death row to ADX Florence, the inmate transfer that terrified prison officials to transfer order. Hit subscribe before the lights go out. Smash like if you're brave enough to keep watching, and comment where you're listening from. Because once the story starts, there's no turning back. The sirens were already screaming when the prison lights flickered. Not the steady hum inmates were used to, but a sudden dip, a breath held by the building itself. At San Quentin State Prison, the night shift had just begun when the emergency call came in. 2 officers down in a restricted corridor near death row, one unresponsive, the other bleeding and whispering a name he wasn't supposed to say. By the time the warden arrived, the corridor was sealed. Yellow tape stretched across concrete that had seen a century of violence, regret, and waiting. A body lay beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb, eyes open, as if surprised the end had come here of all places. There were no signs of a riot, no alarms triggered by inmates, just silence, thick and deliberate. The name the injured officer whispered before losing consciousness was Marcus Vale. Vale had been on death row for 11 years, convicted of orchestrating a triple homicide tied to a sprawling financial fraud ring. He was known in official reports as compliant, intelligent, and low incident. To the men who worked the tiers, he was something else entirely. They called him the listener, a man who asked questions that lingered long after he stopped talking, a man who remembered things he shouldn't know. Within an hour, Sacramento was on the line. Within 2, the federal government was listening. The official story was clean. An officer collapsed due to a medical emergency. Another slipped while responding. No inmate involvement. No breach. But behind sealed doors, senior officials weren't asking what happened. They were asking why it happened now. Because 3 days earlier, an internal memorandum had circulated quietly through the Department of Corrections, a document stamped with a classification level few people ever saw. At the center of it was a single line that changed everything. Transfer approved, Marcus Vale. Destination, ADX Florence. ADX Florence was not just another prison. It was a sentence beyond sentences. A place designed to disappear people who could not be controlled, communicated with, or contained anywhere else. Death row inmates didn't go there. Not unless something had gone very wrong. Or something was about to. Vale had been requesting legal materials nonstop for weeks. Old trial transcripts. Financial records sealed by court order. Names of witnesses who had vanished into federal protection. He filed grievances that went nowhere, appeals that weren't meant to win. To the untrained eye, it looked like desperation. To the analyst who reviewed his file, it looked like preparation. The morning after the incident, Special Investigator Elena Cross arrived at San Quentin. She had spent her career cleaning up institutional disasters no one else wanted attached to their name. Riots, corruption, disappearances. She was known for 2 things: never believing the first explanation, and never asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer herself. Cross stood in the corridor where the officer had died, eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the blind corners. There were no cameras here. That wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. This corridor doesn't exist on the public maps, the deputy warden said, voice low. It's older than the current security system. Then why was anyone here at midnight? Cross asked. The deputy didn't answer. Vale's cell was searched next. It was spotless. Too spotless. His few personal items were neatly arranged, legal papers stacked and labeled. No contraband. No notes. No signs of panic or celebration. But Cross noticed something else. A book on the small metal shelf. Its spine cracked in a way that suggested frequent use. It was a history of California prisons. Harmless on the surface, until she flipped through the pages and saw the margins. Tiny marks, dots, dashes, symbols that meant nothing on their own. But Cross had seen this before. Not here, but overseas, in cases involving coded communication that slipped past every digital filter. She photographed every page. By noon, the injured officer was in surgery. By evening, the autopsy confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. The dead officer had not suffered a heart attack. He had been poisoned, slowly, over time. Something administered in microdoses that would never trigger an immediate alarm. The question wasn't how. It was who had access. The answer narrowed the field uncomfortably. That night, Vale was moved to administrative segregation. No explanation given. No warning. When the door closed behind him, he didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He smiled. "You're late," he said to the guard escorting him. The guard didn't respond. Vale had always known this moment would come. He just hadn't known who would blink first. 2 states away, in a federal office that officially didn't handle state inmates, a classified briefing was underway. Analysts reviewed transcripts, phone logs, visitor records. Patterns emerged. Names reappeared. Deals that were supposed to be buried showed signs of life. Vale had not committed the violence he was accused of. That much was still true. But he had witnessed something far more dangerous. A network of financial manipulation that linked private prisons, political donors, and enforcement contracts across state lines. He had tried to expose it once, quietly, through his attorney. The attorney disappeared 6 months later. Officially, it was suicide. Vale stopped talking after that. Now, someone had decided it was safer to move him than silence him permanently. A transfer to ADX Florence would cut off his access to everyone. Lawyers, media, other inmates, even most guards. It was containment, not punishment. But the timing was wrong. Cross reviewed the transfer order in her hotel room, the weight of it settling in her chest. Transfers like this took months of planning, layers of approval, and yet this one had been fast-tracked in less than 48 hours. Someone was afraid. At 2:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. A restricted number. "They found something in the officer's locker," the voice said. "You need to see this." Back at the prison, forensic techs stood over an open metal locker. Inside was a paper cup, dried residue at the bottom. Lab tests were preliminary, but the substance matched the poison in the officer's bloodstream. Cross felt a chill. "Why was this in his locker?" she asked. The tech hesitated. "Because he didn't know it was poison." Tucked beneath the cup was a folded note. No fingerprints. Just a single sentence written in block letters. "He told me it would make me forget." Cross didn't need to ask who he was. Vale's transfer was scheduled for dawn. As the prison prepared to move one of its most dangerous secrets across the country, Cross realized the truth was already slipping through their fingers. Whatever Vale knew had already begun to spread. The officer's death wasn't an accident or a warning. It was a test. And as the transport convoy idled outside the gates, engines rumbling in the dark, a final report landed on Cross's tablet. New evidence recovered from the restricted corridor, hidden behind a false panel no one remembered installing. When they opened it, they found a list of names. Some were crossed out, some were not. And at the bottom of the page was one word that changed the nature of the transfer forever. Florence, the convoy. Before we dive in, smash that subscribe button if you haven't, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. Every single viewer counts in a story this dark and twisted. The first rays of dawn cut through the thick California fog as the convoy rolled out from San Quentin. 3 black SUVs flanked a heavily reinforced transport van, engines growling like predators in the quiet streets. Marcus Vale sat inside, shackled, staring out the small bulletproof window at the prison fading behind him. His expression didn't change, not a flicker of anxiety, not a sign of fear. For him, this was just another layer of the same game he had been playing for years. Yet outside the van, the air itself seemed to thrum with tension. Every turn was monitored by GPS. Every block by federal marshals. Every pedestrian was suspicious. One wrong glance, one wrong movement, and the entire operation could collapse. Detective Elena crossed road in the lead SUV, laptop open, reviewing the data from the previous night. The paper cup in the officer's locker, the cryptic note, the poisoned blood. Each new piece of evidence had deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Vale wasn't just a prisoner. He was a puzzle with deadly consequences for anyone who got close. "Cross," muttered Agent James Klein from the passenger seat, eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "We got someone on a bike, moving too close. Could be a journalist. Could be, I don't know, someone watching." Cross didn't flinch. She had anticipated every angle. She only nodded, fingers tapping the keyboard. The convoy's path was carefully pre-programmed with alternative routes, roadblocks, and random diversions. But no plan could fully account for the unpredictability of people who wanted to interfere. Hours passed in tense silence. The van moved like a ghost across the interstate, a rolling fortress. Inside, Vale remained quiet. He didn't speak to the guards. He didn't even glance at the cameras. Yet, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that he was listening. He always listened. The kind of listening that could unravel careers, expose secrets, and put lives at risk. At a rest stop halfway through Nevada, the convoy pulled into a secured area. The guards checked the perimeter. The tires were inspected. Engines idled. Vale was escorted into a holding area, a steel-reinforced cage inside a sterile room. He remained calm, his face unreadable, his hands cuffed in front of him. Cross walked past him, observing the subtle shifts in the guard's expressions. There was fear there, not of Vale, but of what he knew. The whispers had already started to spread within the department. Some officers had seen documents, some had overheard calls. Vale's transfer was a routine. It was a containment of knowledge far larger than any single homicide conviction. Cross's phone vibrated. A secure message from Sacramento. We have a new lead on the financial network. Someone is leaking info to Vale. Be careful. Her stomach tightened. Someone inside the system, someone trusted, was feeding information. It wasn't just a matter of controlling Vale anymore. It was a race to see if he would expose the network before he even arrived in Florence. Night fell as the convoy crossed the Nevada border. Highway lights flickered, long stretches of asphalt cutting to the desert. Empty except for the hum of the convoy, Vale was allowed minimal communication, strictly controlled. Yet, when the driver glanced at him, he caught Vale's eyes glinting faintly in the dim red interior lights. There was something almost predatory there, something that said he already knew the plan, and it was only a matter of time before it failed. Halfway through Utah, an alert flashed on Cross's tablet. One of the SUVs had experienced a minor mechanical failure, a sensor malfunction, but the pattern of movement suggested it wasn't random. She looked at Klein. They've tried to track us, she said quietly. Someone is shadowing the convoy. Klein grunted. That's impossible. We've been pre-cleared for every mile. Cross didn't respond. She stared at the desert horizon. Someone new, someone powerful, someone willing to act. Inside the van, Vale's fingers tapped lightly against the metal floor, creating a rhythm, not audible to the guards, but to her trained eye. Every small gesture was a message. He was calculating, planning, waiting. By the time the convoy entered Colorado, the sun had risen, casting sharp angles across the highway. Vale's presence was magnetic and menacing in equal measure. Every official in the convoy, federal marshals, prison guards, agents, felt the weight of it. He wasn't just an inmate. He was a threat contained only by steel, concrete, and strategy. Cross reviewed the surveillance footage from earlier checkpoints. A blurry figure had appeared at two separate rest areas, moving near the convoy before disappearing. There was no record of entry, no fingerprints, no plates, and yet the presence was undeniable. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of Denver, the tension was palpable. Guards whispered amongst themselves. Phones were checked, radios squawked, and Vale continued to sit silently, hands cuffed, eyes forward. He didn't react, didn't shift. Yet, everyone knew that in the quietest moments, he was far more dangerous than the weapons surrounding him. At a secured federal holding facility just outside Denver, the convoy paused for refueling and mandatory breaks. Vale was escorted to a separate, heavily reinforced isolation cell. Cross followed, watching as the guards fumbled with the key cards and locks. There was a nervousness she hadn't seen in years, a fear that something invisible could go wrong at any moment. Cross leaned close to the cell, keeping her voice low. You know why they're moving you, don't you? Vale turned his head slightly. They're afraid of the wrong things, he said softly, eyes dark. Fear doesn't control knowledge. That was the problem. Vale's knowledge could topple systems, reveal deals, exposed deaths and disappearances long covered up by bureaucracy. ADX Florence wasn't just a prison. It was a guarantee of isolation. But the knowledge he carried would not be contained so easily. As the convoy prepared for the final leg, crossing the plains into Kansas, Cross knew they were running out of time. Every mile brought Vale closer to the most secure prison in the United States, and every mile allowed the network of corruption he'd uncovered to remain dangerously active. She stared at the small camera lens in the van, a lens Vale had undoubtedly noticed. She knew that he had already calculated every risk, every pattern, and every opportunity. For him, the journey was as much about observation as it was about survival. And then it happened, the first sign of direct interference. A truck appeared on the opposite lane, flashing high beams. It wasn't just a distraction. Its movement suggested coordination. Someone on the ground, someone monitoring, was trying to make contact or derail the operation entirely. Cross barked orders over the radio. Convoy vehicles swerved slightly. Guards readied sidearms. The transport van slowed, engines growling. Vale's face remained calm, unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, observing. In that moment, Cross realized the stakes were no longer hypothetical. Vale's transfer was about to become a fight for control, not just for the convoy, not just for the prison, but for the secrets he carried, secrets that could bring down powerful figures across multiple states. By the time the convoy crossed into Kansas City, the attackers, or observers, had vanished. But the message was clear. Vale was being watched, every step of the way. And if anyone thought this was just a transfer from California to Florence, they were dead wrong. This was a journey into the heart of fear, power, and human cunning. A journey that could not fail. Because if it did, someone would die, and someone already had. The night fell over the convoy, and Vale leaned back, eyes closed for the first time, not resting, calculating. By the next morning, the federal authorities would have a full picture of the threats facing the convoy. But one thing remained uncertain: Vale's knowledge. He wasn't just an inmate. He was the key, and someone somewhere was willing to kill to keep him silent. ADX Florence, the final confrontation. Before we dive in, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. Share your thoughts, theories, and let us know if you think anyone could survive what's coming next. Your views matter, every single one. The convoy moved like a serpent through the early morning mist of the Colorado plains. By now, Vale had been in transit for nearly 36 hours. Each mile brought him closer to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States, where every wall, corridor, and cell had been designed to break the mind and contain the body. Inside the transport van, the silence was oppressive. Vale remained motionless, hands cuffed, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, punctuated by the distant growl of engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. He wasn't sleeping. He was calculating, mapping every possible scenario, every potential threat. For him, this journey was not confinement. It was reconnaissance. Outside, the world was just as tense. Federal marshals flanked the van in a tight formation, eyes scanning the horizon, ready for any interference. Every checkpoint had been pre-cleared. Every mile had been accounted for. Yet the events of the previous day had proven one thing: nothing could be controlled entirely. Someone, somewhere, was tracking convoy, watching, waiting. The first obstacle appeared just past the Utah border. A dark sedan pulled onto the highway in a manner too deliberate to be random. Its speed and trajectory suggested surveillance. Klein immediately radioed Cross. "They're on us again," he said, voice tight. "Someone's following the convoy. I can't get a read on them." Cross fingers flew across her tablet, triangulating the vehicle's movements, scanning for plates, for a name, for any trace. But the sedan vanished into the distance before any identification could be made. Vale, for his part, had not flinched. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if reading the situation faster than the technology could. By the time the convoy reached Kansas City, the tension was almost unbearable. Every official knew what was at stake. The transfer of an inmate like Marcus Vale was not just a logistical challenge. It was a test of nerve, strategy, and control. One misstep, one overlooked detail, could result in disaster. Vale was escorted into a temporary federal holding cell outside Kansas. It was a cold, sterile room with metal walls and minimal light. The isolation was designed to keep him calm, or perhaps to gauge his reaction. Yet when he sat down on the reinforced bench, he seemed almost at ease. He had already memorized every detail of the cell, the cameras, the locks, the guards' positions. Cross watched him carefully. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to him. Vale tilted his head. "Sleep is for those who don't plan," he said softly. "I prefer awareness." That awareness would prove critical as the convoy continued into Nebraska and eventually Iowa. The threat that followed them previously seemed to vanish, but the tension never fully lifted. There was an understanding among the marshals that someone, somewhere, was monitoring this transfer, not as a casual observer, but as a predator ready to strike. By the time they crossed into Missouri, the convoy's lead vehicles reported anomalies. Minor tampering with tire pressure, cameras briefly disabled, and a faint signal interference on their communication systems. Every technician, every official, every marshal understood the implication. This was coordinated. Someone was testing the defenses, probing the security. Inside the van, Vale's eyes followed the ceiling again, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. He wasn't concerned about the guards or the technology. They were predictable. The real danger came from human error, from the unseen hands manipulating events from miles away. Late that evening, just as the convoy entered Kansas, Cross noticed a blinking light on her tablet. A new signal, unregistered, approaching the convoy from the opposite lane. It wasn't random traffic. It was precise, deliberate, and it was closing fast. "Klein," she said sharply, "prepare for evasive maneuvers. This is not a coincidence." The marshals executed a carefully rehearsed protocol. The van slowed. The SUVs shifted formation, and the unknown vehicle was kept at a calculated distance. All the while, Vale sat silently, hands cuffed, eyes forward. But there was a subtle shift in his expression, an almost imperceptible smirk. He knew this confrontation was coming. Hours later, the convoy reached the outskirts of Florence, Colorado. ADX loomed in the distance like a fortress carved from stone and steel, its towers black against the night sky. Every mile closer heightened the anxiety in the lead SUVs. Every mile closer increased the stakes. Inside the facility's perimeter, Vale was carefully escorted from the van. The guards moved like a synchronized machine, anticipating every movement. Cameras tracked each step. Sensors scanned for anomalies. And yet, as he was guided into facility, Vale's calm, calculating presence remained unshaken. The cell door clanged shut behind him, sealing him in what was supposed to be absolute containment. ADX Florence was designed to neutralize even the most dangerous inmates, to erase their influence, to crush their will. But Vale wasn't just dangerous. He was intelligent, observant, and patient. Cross remained outside the cell, observing from the secure control room. The files, the investigations, the intelligence, all pointed to one fact. Vale had knowledge that could dismantle operations far beyond the walls of the prison. Every guard, every official, every agent understood the implication. He wasn't just an inmate. He was a key. And then the first anomaly appeared. A guard reported a missing document. Another reported a suspicious call on an internal line. Subtle, almost insignificant incidents, but they were the first signs that Vale's presence was already causing ripples. Hours turned into days. Vale remained isolated, but the intelligence he carried did not. Every secure conversation, every guarded file, was now under scrutiny. Cross and Klein worked tirelessly, trying to understand the network he had exposed, trying to anticipate his next move. Then, just when it seemed the tension might finally ease, an unexpected revelation hit. A guard who had been transferred in the same convoy had attempted to smuggle a note to Vale during the journey, a note detailing potential allies inside the facility. Cross realized immediately that the transfer wasn't merely a containment of a dangerous inmate. It was a battleground for controlled secrets. Vale had survived the journey. ADX had contained his body. But the information he held was already infiltrating the system, challenging power structures far beyond the prison walls. And the more the authorities tried to tighten the control, the more difficult it became to suppress the consequences of what he knew. Weeks later, Cross received a final report from Klein. Every anomaly, every minor breach, every suspicious event during the convoy had been connected. Vale's journey from California's death row to ADX Florence had been observed, tracked, and tested by forces with both the intent and capability to exploit his transfer. Yet, he had survived unbroken, contained, but far from neutralized. As the sun set over the fortress of ADX Florence, Vale sat in his cell, eyes forward, fingers tapping lightly on the metal bench. He wasn't planning an escape. He was planning patience, influence, and observation. The transfer had been a success in the eyes of the authorities. But for Vale, it was merely the beginning. Cross left the facility that evening, staring at the towers of steel and concrete against the darkening sky. She knew one thing with certainty. This was far from over. The inmate may have been transferred, but the story, the secrets, the danger, and the suspense would continue to unfold. And as she turned off her tablet, a subtle chill ran down her spine. Vale wasn't just inside ADX Florence. His presence had already begun to shape events outside the walls. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a game that no one fully understood, and one that would continue long after the transfer. If you think this story was intense, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash that like button, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, share your thoughts, and let us know if you think anyone could survive the secrets Vale holds. Every share, every view, every comment keeps the investigation alive and helps reveal the truth behind the walls of America's most secure prison. Because in a story like this, knowledge is power, and power is deadly.